Hello, and thank you for joining me on one of my worm videos. This week with the worms, I'm starting with the breeder bin. I don't know yet, since this is just the second week, exactly what I'm supposed to be looking for with the breeder bin, but I did note that the worms were towards the top, and in my research, keeping the worms towards the top of the material is what you want to do. So I'm hoping that what I'm doing with the bin is the correct procedure. I have about 2 more weeks before I will harvest the castings and remove what eggs or uh, small worms, juvenile worms are in there, but it's just a basic update with giving it food, giving it grit, and covering it up. I do want to keep the moisture in, as this is not a fully formed bin, so I do always make sure that the paper that I have on top and that the cardboard does have some moisture added, and I come in and do this a couple of times a week. I just don't film it. Moving over to the first of the regular totes. Now this tote is the tote that doesn't have the issue with excess moisture in it. You can see where the bubble wrap was, all of the activity from the worms. They tend to stay more towards the center. And when I turn over the castings themselves do have a nice dark brown appearance to them, but that's more so due to the moisture in them. They're not really broken down because they haven't spent a lot of time in this bin just yet. And I do believe from me using the mixture of cocoa core and cardboard versus all cocoa core or all cardboard shreddings actually that I do, it does look like it's breaking down a bit faster. So I'll have to keep in mind what I did this time with my bins so that when it comes time to harvest, I don't harvest too soon before this actually has all the nutrients and microbes that should be in there. Other than the appearance of the castings, once again, another week where I don't see any worms trying to escape. And this is important because I'm adding cocoa core and cardboard each and every week. So that kind of changes their environment each week. So I will always look for that whenever I add new bedding to a bin to see how the worms are adjusting to it. But they seem to be doing well, so I'm adding another layer to bring the level of material up again. I could see some dry spots in the cocoa core that I didn't get to, so I'm watering this one down. And I'll have to make a note next week not to attribute any excess moisture to something I did in the bin, but more so just to adding the water. And once that's all done, this bin is updated for the next week. Moving over to the second of the regular totes, I am doing something different in this tote with both the bubble wrap and the food. So with the bubble wrap, I am focusing the bubble wrap just on the side that has that was fed the previous week. Before, I kept it across the whole thing, and since this bin once again is holding on to moisture, I'm going to start doing the bubble wrap just to one side because I don't need to keep the moisture in on both, in hopes that this will level out the excess moisture in this bin. As I mix up the castings and the bedding that's in the bin, I did see a good sized worm ball here in my hand. It was surrounded by some of the food from the previous week, but I did note that the moisture again was heavier on the side where the food was, which I would expect given how I put the bubble wrap on one side. So it is doing what I want. It's just over time what will happen inside the bin. Despite the issue with the excess moisture on this bin, I'm going to give it a regular sized feeding. So I took those apple pieces out because I wanted to give them actual food scraps instead of something that's going to be in the bin for week after week. So I put some banana peel instead, gave it the grit, and then added some additional bedding to this bin as well. I just put it over the food on the side that was fed. I didn't mix it in through everywhere, and then on the opposite side I put it on top. I did not add additional moisture to this one by the watering can because it already has additional moisture in it, and this bin is updated for the next week. For the first of the Vermi bag totes, the castings in this bin, the material and the castings in this bin are noticeably drier than the regular totes, which again is a feature of the Vermi bag totes as they are made to allow for the water to evaporate and moisture to evaporate from all sides. Given this, since it is my winter, this is something that I need to focus on because it will ultimately lead to the castings drying out, and I don't want that. So as I feel around in this bin, I am noticing that there's more pockets of dry material and bedding that didn't exist in the regular totes. Because of this, I'm not going to add additional material yet to this bin. I don't want this to get too dried out. I'm just going to wet this bin down after I give it its feeding. So after sifting through and fluffing through with my hands and not finding any large pieces of food or any worm balls, I had made the decision that I'm going to give this a good size feeding. So just like the previous bin where it got the squash slice and some of the banana, I'm going to give the same thing to this bin. And that actually might be a pepper. I can't fully remember, but I'm going to give it some food that does have a good amount of moisture inside of the food. That way it can be spread out through the bin. But once I provided the grit and covered up the food, this bin was also set up for the next week. With the exception, I did add water to this bin as well. I can't forget that it did add the moisture to it. So in the next week, when I look at this bin, I just have to remember the water content and the wetness of the castings can be attributed to it getting an additional amount of water added to it at the very end. But then these are set up for the week and no roaming worms as well in this bin either. So for the second Vermi bag tote, this Vermi bag I am focusing on growing the worm colony in this. So the juvenile worms and wisps and cocoons that I collect from the breeder bin are going to go directly into this bin. Something pretty cool that I don't always see week to week in this bin is the worms that are hanging out on the newspaper. So they're coming up out of the castings, which I think is a good thing for this bin because it means that the worms are actually moving around. I still have a colony that's thriving. I am taking a more hands-off approach to this one as it's working in conjunction with the breeder bin. And what I'm doing here is not so much fluffing the castings as trying to bring the drier castings on the edges all together. I'm not doing much with this bin beyond just feeding it and making sure that it keeps and hangs on to the moisture. It's a interesting balance for me with this one because I'm not adding any new material, and since there's not a lot of material, I do want to make sure it stays moist and that the worms are able to breathe, since they do breathe through the moisture and wetness on their skin. So making the material in this bedding more compact and closer is important for me. So again, not really fluffing and going through because I'm not reaching all the way to the bottom and bringing the castings up. All I'm doing is trying to keep them closer together so that they conserve on the moisture level in there. So after giving this a feeding and covering it up with the grit and making sure that all the newspaper that I keep on these castings is thoroughly saturated, I will close this bin up. Again, with the population being so low, I'd be surprised if I saw any roaming worms outside of what's on the paper. So I didn't see any evidence of that, but I am going to again focus on the moisture on this, and this bin is set up for the next week. This brings me to my last and final bin, which is my only flow-through system, the Vermibag Mini. Now, week after week, I talk about how I have crispy edges on the Vermibag Mini, and I do believe my method of putting the wetter material around the edges and the less moisture containing food in the center is helping with the crispy edges. But as I opened the bin this week and saw the square where the worms look like the most activity, I started to wonder whether it's the bubble wrap as well that I have on top of this contributing, because the piece does leave a lot of the edges open. So in the coming weeks, I'm going to consider maybe cutting an additional piece so that I can fit it better over the top and see how that works on the bin instead. But this week, I'm not going to do anything different. I am making my little trough so that I can put the food around the edges, and for this bin I had to go with the apples, so these aren't as don't hold as much moisture after they've been frozen for me, so we'll see how it works out. But I do give them grit around their edges, and then I cover that up, and then I actually will put some more food in the center. I'm not afraid to put a bunch of food into the Vermibag Mini. It has shown me time over time that it can handle a lot of food, a lot of moisture, and the number of worms that I have in here do break down the food pretty quickly. So that will get covered up. The banana that I put in there will get covered up as well. And that completes the update for all of my bins. If you stuck with me this far, once again, thank you so much. I do hope you enjoyed the content. Please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you very much for watching.